I was interested in, I've been reading Steve's new book, and it's fascinating, it's important, it's informative, it's also frightening because it confirms what I've learned about my own memory and how malleable and how memory works, which he goes into in quite a bit of detail, and how things can, well, I'll let him explain it, but memory plays an important role even in events like the first vision and how memory is dealt with. And I'm anxious to hear what he has to say, but I'll just tell you really quick a story, and I'm sure Steve's got many of these probably by now, but think about some of the things that you've treasured as memories and you're just positive they're exactly accurate and you remember everything. I have a friend who, if I mentioned his name, you'd know him, an author, a very bright person, and he said for years he told a story about an event that had happened to him. I can't even show you what my memory's like. I can't even remember what the event was now. But finally, after he'd told this story to friends and others, his wife said, "Now, you do realize that that happened to me and not you." And he'd been telling it in the first person, so I fear that that has probably happened to more than one of us. But anyway, I'm anxious to hear what Steve has to say. He earned a PhD in early American history from Lehigh University. This is not the Lehigh of Nephi fame, of course, where he was Lawrence Henry Gibson Fellow. Wasn't in a conference that we heard some speakers said that we need more Nephi and less Wi-Fi. Anyway, we probably need more Lehigh too, don't we? He taught at BYU campuses in Hawaii and Utah and served as a volume editor of the Joseph Smith papers, and later as managing historian and general editor of Saints, which if you haven't read Saints by now, or at least if you don't own a copy, you're in like 0.002% of the church. No, I wish that were true. Anyway, it's a fascinating read, much different than church published histories in the past. So he was general editor of that, and also has written dozens of articles and on early LDS history, a couple of books. He is currently the editor of BYU Studies and a professor of church history and doctrine at BYU. So this is the book that just came out. He also did Making Sense of the Doctrine and Covenants, a guided tour through modern revelations, which is excellent. And I'll just be honest, Steve, some of the commentaries and related things that I've seen in my 40-plus year career on the scriptures have been disappointing. I don't put yours in that category. I think it's an excellent work on the Doctrine and Covenants. So I will now turn the time over to Stephen Harper. Let me just set this here. Oops. Okay. Now, if you want to just stick that in your pocket, or put it up here, and let's see how this goes. Let's test that out.
How's that sound? Okay.
Okay.
Well, this is a lot of fun. I'm really thrilled to be here. A self-selecting audience of people who are super nerds about the same stuff I am a nerd about. So it's a delight. Otherwise, I'd be at Mutual tonight trying to teach kids who didn't want to hear anything I had to say. So this is a wonderful welcome opportunity. I don't know quite where to begin and where to go. I'm a little worried about getting bogged down. And I don't want to do that. I think I'll fly at 30,000 feet over the book for a while. And as we go along, if you've got things that are on your mind, let me know. And that way we'll be able to, I'll sort of go the direction you want. But I've been likening what I've done in the first part of the book. The book is in 3 parts. The first part's about Joseph Smith's memory. The second part's about how the first vision becomes a collective memory of Latter-day Saints. And then the third part's about how it becomes a contested memory, about 1940 or so, on to, of course, right into our present day. So the first part I've been likening to the Harry Potter stories. If you don't know, one of the best things about the Harry Potter stories, it's about a teenage British magician, Harry Potter, and he learns about this magical bowl of memories from his wizard schoolmaster called the Pensieve. And you can put people's memories into this bowl, and then you can stick your face in it and live their memory. You can see their past. And if there was any kind of magic I could have, that would be it. Okay, for a historian, that would be the best possible magical tool. And of course I lacked that magical ability, but that's sort of what I've done with Joseph Smith's memories of his vision. So the book is not about whether the first vision is true or not. A historian can't figure that out. All that a historian can do with the historian's tools is analyze the memories of the vision that were left. And the book operates on the premise that's well founded in memory studies, psychology and neuroscience, that a memory is not the past. A memory is a present creation. We make our memories in real time. This might seem counterintuitive. It might seem contrary to everything you've ever thought or supposed, but this is absolute, well backed up by all kinds of good research. There are cues, or well, let's say it this way, there are what Professor Schachter at Harvard, a leading memory scholar, calls traces. Traces that are somehow inside of us, in our brains or something, and when we are cued by something or other, we create a memory out of those traces. So out of the pieces of the past that we have at our disposal, and out of our present circumstances, we create a memory. And that's the first premise of this book. Therefore, what was happening in Joseph's present in 1832, in 1835, in 1838, 39, 1842, when he created the memories that he left us of his first vision? So the first part of the book tells the story of him making and recording those memories. It has as much to do with the present circumstances he was in the summer, fall of 1832, as it does about what happened in the Grove in the spring of 1820. Both of those things are important, and they come together in his first autobiography. And then in his journal entry for the November 9th, 1835, that present, him talking to Robert Matthias and sort of comparing prophetic credentials, that comes together with what happened in the spring of 1820, right? So you get a present, you get a memory that's made out of Joseph's present situation and the experience in the Grove. I think that's a really important point to understand. And so I bring in the book the historical method to bear on the question, as well as a fair amount of neuroscience and the psychology of memory. I'm not expert in that stuff. I've been reading it carefully for 10 years, but I'm dependent on the experts to educate me on that stuff. This is, in some ways, the first time there's been a book written on Latter-day Saint history that is a marriage of real deep immersion in the historical record and memory studies. So the historical profession has been drawing on memory studies now for a good while, but Latter-day Saint studies not so much. There have been some really good pioneering pieces of work done. This is the first book, as far as I know, where those things are brought together. I thought it would be a fun test, a challenge to see if we could do this, and I've been working on it for 10 years, and I'm really excited to see it out. Don't look carefully at page 209 or 238, however, because there are typos. Vexing. I can't tell you how vexing it is to find typos after you've been over it 100 times, and then of course they jump off the page. That seems to be the case no matter what you do. Dan Vogel, who, as you know, is a scholar of early Mormonism, has written a biography of Joseph Smith, and it begins with this question. What David Hackett Fisher, a great historian, calls a declarative question, a question that presupposes its own answer. So Vogel's question is, when Smith fails to mention foundational visions until years after the event, the first vision, and gives conflicting and anachronistic accounts of them, how certain can one be that he relates events as he experienced them at the time? Right? So I think that's a bad question. And I want to ask the question, how did Joseph Smith, what can the historical method tell me about how Joseph experienced the vision at the time? But I'm also just as interested in what can it tell me about how Joseph Smith experienced the vision over time? Because his memories are not just what happened in the grove. His memories are what that experience meant as he went throughout his life, right? Same way your memories are and my memories are. So if we track his memories, 1832, 35, 38, 39, 1842, we're experiencing the vision as he re-experiences it throughout his whole life. And if we're really careful, we can learn some of the things he thought at the time, and then we can see some things that he only thought over time, if we look carefully at his vision accounts. Here's a couple of quotes. One from Professor Schachter, who says, just as visual perception of the three-dimensional world depends on combining information from the two eyes, perception in time, or remembering, depends on combining information from the present and the past. Okay? Or Roger Shattuck, merely to remember something is meaningless unless the remembered image is combined with a moment in the present. Okay? Very important point. And let me try to illustrate this by telling you how it came home to me clearly one day. I was watching my youngest son, who's now 6'2", and bigger than me, but he was about 10 years old at the time. And I was watching him play with a new set of Legos, one of the ones that comes in a small box, and it's got all the pieces to make the image that's on the front of the box. So he built that very carefully, followed the picture to the T, and then he took it apart and he rebuilt it, except different. He used almost all the same pieces, left some out, but he rebuilt it. It was the same basic object, but it was different than the one before. Then he did it again and again. And I was deep in the reading of the memory studies and immersed in the first vision accounts, thinking about these issues while I was watching him do that. And I thought, that is how memories work. That's how Joseph Smith's memories of his first vision are. They're made out of pieces of the past. And they are made in a present, right there, constructed right then and there. And they vary. They have variations in them, depending on which pieces he adds and how he connects them together, right? So I think that there's a better answer than the one we've developed to why is there variation in Joseph's vision accounts, right? You've probably heard by now that we explain that often by saying he intended them for different audiences. That's true enough, but however true it is, I don't think it's the best explanation. And I think a better one is to explain the variation in his memories based on the way memories consolidate or form over time. And that has an awful lot to do with this point I've been making about memories being a mixture of the past and the present. Whatever difference there is in the present between 1832 and 35 is going to be the main determinant of the difference in the vision memories that Joseph gives us in those years. Everybody with me so far? Am I making any sense? All right, so let's ask, this is what the book does, what difference would it make for Joseph to recall the vision in each of those different presents? Okay, so I'm going to do that in just a minute, but first I want to introduce you to another major premise of the first chunk of the book. It is that one of the most significant determinants of Joseph Smith's memories of his vision, the way they form and shape, is the rejection he received from the Methodist ministers a few days after it happened. I think that is a huge factor in each one of the accounts, sometimes by its absence. I've proposed that the 1835 account is really not beholden to the minister's rejection, but that the 1832, 39 are very much shaped by it. I hypothesize, in other words, that each of the accounts can be best read in light of how it relates to the Methodist minister's rejection. So let me say it this way. What would happen if Joseph was so deeply wounded by that rejection that he didn't tell anyone else? There's zero evidence in the historical record that he told anyone else. None. Then what if he tried to write an autobiography 12 years later at age 26, still smarting from that rejection, a few months after he'd been beaten and tarred by a mob? How would that memory sound? And if my hypothesis is right, if there's anything in what I'm proposing, then these are the characteristics that memory would have. It would be a strategic retrieval. That is, the cue for his memory creation would be, okay, I've been told 2.5 years ago by the Lord, let there be a record kept, and I knew it was important, but I didn't do anything about it. And he's just barked at me again in the Revelation, was now D&C 85, saying, I really meant it, you've got to keep close, careful records. So I've gone out and bought a journal and a letter book, and I'm going to start an autobiography. Okay? So he dutifully starts writing in his journal every day for a week, and then he quits for a year. He starts writing an autobiography. And it's the exercise of responding to that revelation and writing that autobiography that I mean by strategic retrieval. A very conscious process of thinking, okay, how does my story begin? What's the memory of my story? Strategic retrieval of the memory. So, excuse me, this memory might psychologically work to please or appease that minister. Not the actual minister, but sort of the ghost of that minister hanging over Joseph Smith. It might put emphasis on things that Joseph has in common with the Methodist minister. It might sound like a generic Methodist conversion experience of being convicted of my sins and receiving Christ's forgiveness after praying in the woods. God and Christ as separate beings, not emphasized. It might refer only to one divine being, or it might refer to both simply as Lord, but there's not an explicit emphasis on, I saw two beings. I've been reading Paul's epistles in the New Testament, as you probably have, or may be, and I am stunned at how explicit he is on the distinction between God and Christ. Joseph, not so much in his earliest first vision memory. There's no creeds are abominable to God, no professors are corrupt, there's no emphasis on persecution, nothing about opposition from Satan. I think, if my theory is right, that we get an account that's true, but probably not true enough to Joseph's 1832 present. Okay, I think there's dissonance between him trying to write something that's not going to get his teenage self hurt again, and write something that's consistent with what he now knows and who he now is, right? He's just received the vision of the heavenly glories, D&C 84. His theology has gone way beyond evangelical Christianity. And a memory is true, psychologically speaking. It's true if it's true to ourselves, if it's true to our present. So that memory we were hearing about a bit ago, that was true to the person telling it. He believed that what he was telling was true, even though it happened to his wife, not to him. So I don't mean true in an objective sense. I mean, in a subjective sense, true. And Joseph's 1832 memory is probably not true to him. Okay, in trying to make it safe for the public that opposed him last time he told the story, he tells a story that I don't think is very satisfying to him. The reason I think that is because there is no evidence that he shares it. Not with John Whitmer or Oliver Cowdery, who are tasked with writing the church's history. Neither one of them shows any awareness of that 1832 document. Joseph seems to stick it away. Maybe Orson Pratt reads it or hears the contents of it or part of the contents of it because his 1840 account does share clear echoes of it, some wording even, but that's the only indication that Joseph shares that with anybody at the time. And as you might know, it comes across the plains in Janetta Richards' trunk, but it stays on the shelves in the church's archive until 1965, when it's published in a master's thesis. And very, very, very few people know about it in the meantime. All right? What would happen if Joseph, at age 29, wasn't trying to write autobiography? He's not consciously trying to remember how his story goes. He's just spontaneously conversing with this visitor from the East who claims to be a prophet of sorts and who's come to see Joseph because he claims to be a prophet. And so they're exchanging credentials in a way, and Joseph says, let me tell you the story of how the Book of Mormon came forth. It started with me feeling worried about my sins, going to God in prayer in the woods and receiving this glorious vision. So it's the first time in the historical record he uses the word first to describe the vision, right? Because the present, the 1835 present, is shaping very much the memory. You don't come out of the grove and say, Mom, I just had my first vision, right? In 1920, you don't write about winning the First World War. You tell about the first vision after subsequent visions. And you don't have a First World War until after a Second World War. So you can't remember things in that way that we tend to until there's a lot of other experience that shapes the way the memory works and the way it forms. So here he uses the word first. Well, the first thing that happened to me in the series of events that led to the publication of the Book of Mormon was this vision of two personages. One of them appeared first, said, this is my beloved son, and introduced me to another one who then appeared. They filled me with joy unspeakable, he said. It's a beautiful account. It moves faster. It's faster paced. It's quite dramatic in the up and down. It tells about the satanic power that he feels. This, if you didn't know, but you had to pick out of a lineup, which one of these does he tell spontaneously and which are autobiographical writings? You could pick out of the lineup the one that he's just telling because of the pace of it and the sort of the, I don't know what word is better than pace. I hope that adequately explains what I'm trying to say there. Okay? Do you see what I mean by the difference between a spontaneously retrieved and created memory and a strategically retrieved memory? Read those again sometime and you'll see the difference there. If you don't know where to get these, they're all over the place now. They're in the Gospel Library app, in the church history part, First Vision accounts right there. They're on the Joseph Smith Papers website. They're conveniently gathered. And if you just search First Vision accounts, the first hit you'd get would be the church's essay titled First Vision Accounts, which has links to all the documents. And the second one you'd get is Joseph Smith Papers collection of these. So easy to get to these days. What would happen if Joseph, age 33, started writing autobiography again, unsatisfied with the first one, knowing he has to do it, it's got to be done. If he doesn't record his memory, it will be lost to the world. So he starts writing again after being driven from Ohio by enemies. Then before he can write more than a few pages, he's jailed in a cold, cramped, stinking dungeon cell in Missouri while his wife and children and followers flee the governor's order to the militia to drive them from the state. What would happen if he started dictating history a few months later, again on the other side of the Mississippi River, having finally escaped from Missouri hell? What would happen, in other words, if he wrote history after the worst, most persecuted year of his life? In that case, it might sound like he spat it out in defiance. It might say, owing to the many reports put in circulation by evil disposed and designing people, I'm going to tell you the truth. And it might, instead of trying to appease that minister, it might take him head on, right? it might use the word priest to describe him and all the other Protestant clergy, knowing very well that Catholic brush that he's painting them with. That's not an intentional slight to call the Protestant ministers priest, as the canonized account of the first vision does. It would be persecution dominated, right? And when you read that account again, the one that's in the Pearl of Great Price I'm talking about now, notice how often it talks about persecution. Hot persecution, the bitterest persecution. My life has been characterized by persecution, he says. This would be a mixture of factual memory, which is the kind where you say things like, it was a morning in the early spring of 1820. I read James 1 and 5. This is how I felt about it. I went to the woods. I knelt down. I saw two persons after being nearly overcome by this actual but unseen being. That's factual memory, okay? The stuff that would be the same the day of the vision and 50 years later. But it also would be clear full of interpretive memory. Right? This is where we get lines like, it has often caused me serious reflection both then and since. This is where he tells us, I've been thinking about that event in the woods my whole life. Sort of trying to figure out what it was all about and what it means and how I should think about it and what does it mean after the Book of Mormon comes forth and after the church is organized. Okay, so think about these lines that tell us that he's doing interpretive memory. He's giving meaning to the event as he re-experiences over time. This is where he tells us, I've often thought since that I felt like Paul before Agrippa when he made his defense. Right? Nobody believed him either, but I felt like him. I felt that same rejection. There's a bunch of wonderful interpretive memory in that account. And I think it's quite fascinating to now be able to look at a version of that account that comes a couple of years later. As you might know, a few years ago, the First Presidency gave the Joseph Smith Papers a whole bunch of other documents, including a fair copy, a later copy of the account that's now in the Pearl of Great Price. So think about what would happen if a couple of years go by, Missouri is fading into the background, Carthage is not even on the horizon, the Illinois legislature is fawning over you, tripping over themselves to give you a very liberal charter with your own army, your own courts and so forth. You're feeling protected now. And you come back to that document, you look at it again, and you think, wow, I was frustrated that day. So you cut off the part, the prologue about owing to the many reports put in circulation by able to dispose and designing people. You just start, I was born in Sharon, Vermont. And you cut off that big interpretive chunk, right? When he comes out of the grove and tells the minister, some few days after, I was in the company of a Methodist minister who had been influential in the aforementioned religious excitement. I told him what I'd experienced, and he responded with great contempt, telling me it was all of the devil. That factual memory is followed in the canonized account with a big interpretive memory, right? It felt like I'd been persecuted from the time I was an infant, he says. And Fawn Brody famously says, there's no evidence that he was persecuted as an infant. His memory is not very good. And she's confusing the factual memory with the interpretive memory. He wasn't persecuted as an infant. Nobody came around, horsewhipping Tottle or Joseph Smith. Nobody was worried about that at all. That didn't happen. What he's telling us there is, when I search my memory in the wake of Missouri and think, well, how did all this start? The feeling, the emotion that comes back when he cues himself up that way is, I have been persecuted my entire life. Right? And especially when he thinks, I remember when I walked out of the grove a few days later, I told the minister he rejected me. Then notice the very next emotion, the very next interpretive memory is, yeah, it's felt like that forever. That was the beginning of hot, bitter persecution. It felt like I was Paul. It felt like I've had a whole, since infancy, it's been like that. So he's telling us what his life feels like at that moment. He's not telling us about facts in that part of the memory, about facts of the vision itself. He's telling us more about how he is experiencing the vision at the time of the memory than about how he experienced it on that day in the spring of 1820. I hope this is making sense. All right. If I'm thinking right, then a couple years later he revisits that account. He takes off the front part of it that sounds so defiant. He drops out the parts that are most antagonistic toward the other Protestant clergymen, and he drops out that whole part that I love so much about I knew it, I knew God knew it, I could not deny it. That part where, if my theory is right, he is responding directly to that Methodist minister, saying, when I was younger and I was sort of that teenager, I tried to write autobiography and my mind went back to being that teenage kid, and I tried to give you a story that you wouldn't reject me if I told you. I'd be safe. He's not doing that here. He's defiant now. He's all grown up, Joseph Smith. He is the president of the Church of Christ now, and he says, I knew it, I knew God knew it. I'm like Paul. I'm like the apostles in the New Testament who also got rejected, but I'm not backing down. So there's that way of experiencing the memory in that present, after Missouri, after being driven from Ohio, that I think shapes the way he tells it. He drops that whole chunk of interpretive memory out of the fair copy. Okay, a couple years later, when things are settled down, when the hostilities are behind him, he comes back to it, and the present that shaped that hot memory is not as hot. And so the memory, the temperature of the memory cools way down. Right? I think that's useful to understand. What would happen if Joseph, age 36, received a letter from a Chicago newspaper editor or a historian from Philadelphia asking kindly if he would furnish them his story so that they could publish it accurately to inform their readers? That would give us what we call the Wentworth Letter, and has very distinct characteristics compared to these other memories. It's very matter-of-fact, straightforward, it's succinct, it's less emotional and more logical than any of the others. It's not written to a Methodist revival preacher. Okay? He throws in a little Latin. He does PR. He doesn't say, the Lord told me that their creeds are an abomination and all their professors are corrupt. He says, the Lord told me that all the religious denominations were believing in incorrect doctrines and that none of them was acknowledged as his church and kingdom. Same thing, but the temperature of the statement is quite reduced. Much more palatable for public relations than the earlier memory that he's not interested in public relations. He's interested in fighting back against the persecution that's led by the Protestant clergy, as he remembers it, right? When he thinks, who's the source of all this antagonism against me? I remember it's that minister who rejected me a few days after the vision itself. And that's the beginning of all the opposition in Joseph's canonized memory. All right, do you have questions at this point? I've either answered them or you've lost hope that I have anything coherent to say. I couldn't answer anyway. Please.
Do you think the first telling it might have been when Moroni told him to tell the father about that vision? Could he have told him about the other one?
He could have. It's possible. Joseph Sr. didn't leave us anything written down, right? So it'd be Lucy who tells us most of the stuff we know about conversations between Joseph Sr. and Jr. come from Lucy. Memoir. Lucy's memoir is very revealing because it does not have an original memory of Joseph telling the first vision. She doesn't say, I remember when Joseph came home and said, Mom, I just saw the most remarkable thing. When she comes to that point, it just cuts and pastes the manuscript history version, the one that's now canonized in the Pearl of Great Price. She just says, he told the story as good as possible, well as possible, I'm just going to cut and paste that into mine. So she doesn't seem, for everything else, she has her own memory. She remembers what it was like to hear about Moroni and each time Joseph comes home from the hill, but she elaborates at length, but she doesn't seem to have any memory of her own of the vision. And you know that part in the canonized version where he says, Mom, I learned for myself Presbyterianism isn't true? Even that is a late insertion. That's a redaction from 1842 that Willard Richards inserted, maybe at Joseph's direction. There's no reason to think Joseph wasn't directing him to do it. But in other words, the original flow of Joseph's memory has nothing about him telling his family anything about the vision at all. And even if the 42 memory is right, and there's reason to think it may be a blurred memory, right? The concern about Presbyterianism may well be a few years later than 1820, in other words. But even if it is accurate that he said that day, he didn't tell her he'd had a vision. He just said, Mom, I learned for myself that the Calvinists are not right. I don't have to fear going to hell for all eternity. I've just been forgiven. Okay, please.
You said a great deal of persecution took place. Is there anything on record to show that there was persecution? His mother.
When? Like.
Well, he said he said he felt like he was persecuted all of his life.
Right.
Once he went to the minister and told the story,
yeah,
he said that he was persecuted from that time forward.
Right.
Is there anything in his parents' diaries that he was persecuted?
Yeah, there is. Lucy says he got shot at, and we had people be mean to us.
Was it for that issue?
It's impossible to tell for sure. There's no way to know for sure based on the limited evidence that we have at this point.
Is there anything in the record of the area that he was persecuted?
Not that we know of, and that's, as you might guess, that record has been combed pretty well.
Well, the reason I ask that is that there is evidence in the record that other people had visions.
Yeah.
And they were published in the newspapers.
Right, right.
And they weren't persecuted.
Yeah, it's not terribly unusual, as several scholars have now shown, for someone to say, I just had a vision in the woods of God and of Christ sometimes, right? Or of angels. Charles Finney, who goes on to be maybe the foremost revival preacher of the 19th century, is not far away in Adams County in 1820, in his law, praying in the woods, and then returning to his law office and having a vision of Christ. The difference is over time he will soften that vision. He will make it theologically compatible with Presbyterianism, which he becomes a Presbyterian minister. Joseph will make his more and more incompatible over time. That's what I'm telling you. That first time he serves up a memory of it, I think I'm not saying he's consciously doing this, but he makes that memory relatively compatible with the Protestant visions that other people are having. But the further he goes, the more their creeds are an abomination, their professors are corrupt, and none of them are the Lord's true church. Yeah, please.
Over time, individuals that I have talked to have said that the big problem they had with the whole vision, first vision scenario, with all of these additions and deletions over time, is separating the significant aspect of the event from other secondary details or aspects that could either be deleted or added later. But the consistency of the most significant thing that happened to him had to be the appearance of the Father and the Son, and how in his own, I guess it was one in his own handwriting, he doesn't refer to two. I guess it's the same one you said he didn't really share with individuals. Yeah. And so one thing about the significant event of in one's memory versus details,
yeah.
How do you respond to that in your book?
I do. More so in the 2012 book than the 2019 book. The 2019 book is not about whether the memories are accurate, it's just about what the memories reveal. So the 2012 book is more devotional. It's written to Latter-day Saints to give them tools to read the accounts and come out believing. So it's important in that light to notice that the idea that he only mentions one divine being in the 1832 account is an interpretation of that account. It's not a fact of that account. The account, this is the fact. The account says, "The Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord. And he said unto me, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee." So we could interpret that, and we might be right, to mean that he only sees the Lord. But when we read all the accounts, both the primary ones and the 5 secondary ones that we have from his own lifetime, 3 of them tell us, including the next one, 1835, 3 of them tell us, I saw one divine being, and he revealed another one, and then I saw the second one. There's nothing in any of the accounts that says I saw 2 personages at the exact same time for the exact same length of time. So in light of the whole historical record, I choose to read the 1832 account to mean this. I saw God, and he revealed Christ. And Christ said to me, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. That's a completely consistent reading. That we can interpret the facts perfectly fine that way. So it's if you're hostile to Joseph, you tend to want to pigeonhole him to embellishing over time with details that are wildly inconsistent, right? But if you're open to believing what Joseph's telling you, it's not hard at all to understand that he might be saying, I saw God who revealed Christ, and to realize, as he says in the very next document in that letter book, where he writes that, O Lord, deliver me from the narrow prison of paper, pen, and ink, and a crooked, broken, scattered, and imperfect language. I'm not a writer. I'm sorry. It defied all description. I can't tell this story very well. He says that over and over at the beginning of his autobiographies, and then right in this letter he writes to William Phelps right after the 1832 autobiography. So I choose to interpret it that way.
I want to make a comment about that. I was reading in Matthew, the 22nd chapter, a text that really supports that point of view that he does, and that he's an inarticulate person.
Joseph is?
Yes, absolutely, and that he can't write worth beans in 1832 especially. And that is, it's in his own hand, and when it says the first Lord, that Lord is inserted. It's a caret.
Right. It's after the fact, there's no doubt about that.
That's right. And Matthew, the 22nd chapter, and I can't remember the verse, I think it's 44, and I'll remember it in 5 minutes, as Kurt would say, when I need it. It says, and the Lord said to my Lord, and clearly those are 2 persons, the Lord and the Lord. And I think that Joseph, being inarticulate and unable to write, reads through it, and after the fact figures that it's not clear that there are 2 persons, and so he inserts and the Lord, inserted as a caret, in the text, in his own hand, and then he goes on to talk about the Lord.
I like your source criticism in light of the Bible, right? Which is the air Joseph breathes is the Bible.
Yep, absolutely.
I might push back a little bit on the idea that he's not articulate.
Well, he's not a good writer.
Right. He acknowledges that,
He's
right?
articulate, but he's not a good writer, and that's what brought up that idea for me when you quoted,
right.
Forgive me for the prison of pen and ink.
Yeah, in a technical sense, not a good writer.
Exactly.
But man, that very statement where he tells what a dreadful writer he is, that is lovely.
Oh, I know. So the fact that maybe he can't, sometimes you write faster than you can think.
Yeah.
And so it's not a matter of audience or memory, as you're saying, but a matter of
ability.
Yeah,
I think you're onto something there. It defied all description. I don't have words
and
to put
the
it
Lord
in.
said to my Lord is a perfect example of that.
Terrific. Thanks for bringing that to our attention.
You know, as a 14-year-old boy, this was, in his mind, a private, personal experience. He had no comprehension that this in any way was going to lead to a church, was going to lead to further revelations. He went with a question as a 14-year-old boy, got an answer, and he felt that was kind of the end of it.
Yeah.
And I'm okay with this. And what 14-year-old boy, innocent in that regard, is going to write anything down or even to remember much?
Yeah, you might excitedly tell the minister who got you thinking that way in the first place,
Right.
but then when he shuts you down, you might clam up for a decade.
That's right.
Right?
But this was a personal event at that point.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with the world or with the new religion.
I like the way you're looking from behind Joseph's eyes, looking forward, because we often project onto him all that he would later know, 10 or 20 years later. He doesn't know any of that at the time. From the historical record, all he knows is, you're forgiven, don't join any of the churches, I'll give you more information later.
Right.
That's what he knows. Please.
There are 2 details that I'd like to amplify a little bit because you've studied this more, but One is that he says the Father has blue eyes. I don't know what color Christ's eyes would be. The Father's eyes are blue. I'm not into genetics. But the other one is that the Father placed his hand over Joseph's eyes, and then he saw, I guess then he saw Jesus, and I assume kind of a panoramic vision of the plan of salvation.
Yeah, I don't know. What you're describing there comes from, it's a third-hand account. Yeah, it's in the diary of Charles Walker, who's a southern Utah resident, late in the 19th century. And he goes to what we would call a fireside, and he hears an old man, John Alger, or Alger, I don't know how to pronounce his name, say, "When I was a kid in Kirtland, Ohio, you'll never believe what I heard." Right? I was at a meeting where Joseph Smith spoke. He told us the story of his first vision, and he used his hand to gesture and said, "God touched me on the eye and revealed Christ. And when he did that, I saw the Savior." So that's the account of being touched on the eye. I teach that sometimes and say to my students, I'm not telling you I know this is true. There's no way for me to triangulate it or verify it. There's no other sources that say it. But I'm evoking it because it tells you something about how Latter-day Saints think about the nature of God. Right? If you're like I am, I'm excited by that very possibility. I read the beginning of the book of Abraham where he says, "God touched my eyes." And I'm thinking, maybe Abraham means that literally. And, there are other believers, devout as any of us are, who would say, that is absurd. This is a nonsensical thing. But a Latter-day Saint like myself thinks that would be very cool if that were true. I hope it is true. That's the way I want to think about it.
Or he touched his heart, and it could be metaphoric.
Sure, could be. The account about the Aryan physical characteristics of the Savior comes from the Alexander Niebuhr journal. This is the one where Joseph tells Niebuhr and some other friends about a month before Joseph is murdered about the vision. This one is rich with detail about the Methodist revival setting of the vision. And it's in this one that, and in no others, where Niebuhr says, Christ has blue eyes, light complexion. I'm not going to emphasize that. Right? That might be true, might be not true. I haven't seen him myself, at least for a good while yet. And don't pretend to know, but I wouldn't want, in the global church, I wouldn't want to emphasize anything that could be construed as, used as a weapon against other God's children. So that's how I think about those things.
I have a question that's sort of different from the specifics of your book.
Great.
And I don't mean any disrespect from it, but we have a lot of contemporary histories which are profoundly helpful to me. Some of them written by people like you who work at BYU, and some of them written by people who work at the U or wherever. So I just would like to know, not just you, but there's those people you work with at BYU.
Oh boy.
If you feel, or they feel, pressure to conform to a particular viewpoint because their job depends on it.
Maybe. I've been accused of that myself. But anybody who accuses me of that just doesn't know me very well. I don't feel pressured to... I'm not a non-conformist hiding as a conformist. If I don't conform to something, I'll tell you. I'll tell you how I think and feel about it. But I have an advocate personality. And the cause I choose to advocate is the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. So I'm at BYU because that's the only university on the planet, the other two campuses too, but where I can be who I am. Right? If I were at the U, I'd have to be half of myself. I could be the historian. Paul Reeve is the same as me, and he's a great historian. He does that skill set up there masterfully, right? And he's, as far as I know, he's content. I shouldn't speak for him, right? I didn't mean to do that, but he does great there. If I were in in his set of shoes, I'd be a little less comfortable. So I'm at BYU because that's where I'm at home. I don't know of anybody on my faculty who doesn't feel similarly to that. I don't think. I think people who do feel the way that you're suggesting some people might, I don't think they stay there. It's not a fun place to be, right? So they would gravitate out. They would find some other setting. So I think people choose for the most part where they're at based on who they really are, not by necessity and then having to hide who they really are. I might be wrong about that, but I know for myself that's how I feel about it.
Well, I'll just follow up and say I'm a retired professor of politics,
Uh-huh.
and I know of tension that exists where
Sure.
I taught, which was back east, between liberals and conservatives,
Yeah.
and it affects the way people present information.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know whether that kind of tension exists at BYU
Yeah.
or
Yeah,
Utah
sure.
or anywhere else.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. BYU is a university campus. It's got all the tensions on it of any university campus, and more because it's a Latter-day Saint campus. Terrifically interesting place to be.
I get the feeling, though, that you indicated that Joseph felt those same tensions, and possibly that's why he hedged or couched his terms very closely in subsequent discussions of this first vision, because he had been put down by that minister. And I'm sure that he thought about, we've all had arguments or discussions when we felt maybe we lost it or our point wasn't made, and you've gone home, you've thought, boy, I wished I'd have approached this different, or why didn't I recall this quick enough, because I could have hit him with this or that, and that's kind of revealed in some of his subsequent discussions of the first vision. I think that the first vision was so profound for a 14-year-old young man that I really don't think he forgot a detail of it. And I think
I do.
Do you really? I think that if he wanted to recall it, he could have asked the Lord, and the Lord would have helped him with his recall.
Yeah.
I know my earliest memory was approximately 3 years old when my tonsils were taken out in the living room of our home, and I was standing in my crib in my parents' bedroom, and my father carried my mother in, who had just had her tonsils removed, and the blood was coming out of the corner of her mouth, and I'm shouting, "Not me, Daddy!" and I was next.
Yeah.
And that memory has never changed.
Right.
And it's as clear to me today as it was 4 years
So
ago.
memories stick when they're modulated, is the technical term. And the most powerful memory modulator is intense emotion, right?
Yeah.
I'm
I
guessing.
didn't have another memory for 3
Right,
or 4 years.
right. Yeah, that one was seared into you pretty well. And similarly, Joseph knows how he's feeling. Read the accounts and notice the intense things, right? He's really got a deep memory of the dilemma between his head and his heart. I fear in my head that the Presbyterians are right and I'm going to hell because that's where all the evidence leads.
Yeah.
I desperately want in my heart for the Methodists to be right because then I have a chance to do something about it, but there's no evidence. I'm trying hard to have a Methodist conversion, no evidence. So there's that dilemma, that's always there. The epiphany of realizing he can ask God, that's a major breakthrough, that's pronounced, right? And then the vision itself, the relief that comes from the vision, that's always there. But notice, I was about 14, 15th year, 16th year is the 1832, right? There's parts of it that are fuzzy. And that's how our memories work as well. The parts that that are vividly associated with emotion, and then that we replay, that we rehearse over and over, the parts of your tonsillectomy,
Yeah.
right? But there are other parts. I bet you don't know what you were wearing that day when you had your tonsils
Well,
out. Maybe you do.
I'm sure I wasn't wearing much then
Yeah.
in the crib.
So there are some things that Joseph doesn't remember well. He doesn't appear to remember exactly what day on the calendar it was. He doesn't remember exactly how old he was. There are some, you can approximate it
I can
early in the
remember
spring.
the smell of the ether.
Yeah, smells are vivid memory modulators. Please.
I heard it said, and I won't mention the name, but he's a historian at BYU, some time ago said that the 1835 version is an easier version to defend than the 38 version because of the timetables, the timeline, and the facts. that the 1838 or 39 version, whatever date you want to put on that, is really problematical in terms of matching that up with other independent
Yeah.
studies of the history. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I've heard it. That's Reverend Wesley Walters' argument. And that's one way of responding to the Reverend Walters. I talk about the Reverend Walters at great length in the book. I learned to admire him even more than I did in researching the book. I want to shake him by the shoulders, but I admire him very much. So Reverend Walters, a Presbyterian minister, began in the 1960s to write a new kind of critique of the first vision. Nobody had ever done this before. It had just been the Methodist minister whose attack was, that didn't happen. Never did, never has since the apostles, and never will again. So an a priori rejection of the very possibility of a vision. Then the second critique was Fawn Brody's, who said, you know, it's the memory of it's a half-remembered memory. He embellishes it over time, and he invented it late. Right? There's nothing from 1820 or the 1820s. We don't have anything until 1838, 39, when she wrote her first edition. That was all the documentation she had. When she wrote her second edition and the 35 and 32 accounts were available, she just moved the date back. Joseph still concocted it when he needed authority, but she just moved it back from 1838 to 34. So then Reverend Walters comes along and he says, you know, you can't outprove whether Joseph had a vision or not, but you can prove whether he's telling the truth when he says there was an unusual religious excitement in the area where I lived. So he says, I've dug through every church record possible for Palmyra Village for 1820, and there is no unusual excitement on the subject of religion. Therefore, there was no vision that was catalyzed by that. So this person, I'm not sure who that is, they're responding to that point. Reverend Walters goes on to say, there is a full-blown revival in Palmyra in 1824. That's what Joseph Smith is talking about.
And 1817.
Yeah, right, 1817. Not as big a one apparently in 1817, but Professor Bushman responds to Walters by saying, how big is big and how far is far? Right? You're doing the wrong thing here. You're looking backwards and saying, well, compared to what happened in 1824, what happened in 1820 or 1817 was no big deal. Well, Joseph wasn't looking backward from 1824. He's looking forward. He arrives in Palmyra Village in the middle of that 1816, 17 unusual excitement, and it dies down. And then, most importantly, his family moves south. He's not in Palmyra Village at the time of the first vision. And so Walters does a couple of fallacious pieces of reasoning in his argument, in my opinion. One of the things he does is he argues for an irrelevant proof. There's no unusual excitement on religion in Palmyra Village. Well, Joseph didn't say there was. He said the whole district of country was affected by it. The region where we lived was affected by it. And district is a Methodist term. It's like saying a Catholic diocese or a Latter-day Saint stake. Joseph is locating it in Methodist terms. He says it starts with the Methodists, and the district was the location of it. And when Professor Bachman tested that, claim, there's plenty of evidence. I just have been talking to Ann Taves, a great religion scholar at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and her university, under her influence, just acquired the reveries of the diaries of Benijah Williams, a Methodist minister in Mendon, in that area of New York. And they are full of terrific context for all this. They have the Reverend Lane coming back and forth through the area, preaching, starting a reformation, as he puts it. So if you look in the geographical scope and the chronological scope that Joseph gives us, there's no reason to impeach him on his facts. I'll leave it there if you want to read the rest of that.
I just mentioned that Mike Quinn wrote a reasonably definitive
He did,
work
pretty
on
good
this,
one.
which wasn't widely
Yeah.
published, I don't think.
I think it was only electronically published.
Right, but it's a very fine rebuttal of,
Yeah.
of this point.
Yeah,
Talks about
I
how
thought so,
Joseph sold cakes and
yeah,
pastries
right.
at the revivals.
Please.
Later on in life, I've read some articles that Joseph was a little frustrated that he didn't think the saints really understood what he was trying to teach them
No doubt about that.
eternal life. Do you think he said, well, I can't really tell them everything because they just won't quite get it? Or have you run across anything
Oh, yeah.
kind of like that.
Yeah, his late sermons are full of that sentiment. So there's a passage in his mother's memoir for early 1838 where she says that Joseph gathered, this has to be in January of 1838 based on some other documents. Joseph gathered a bunch of church leaders in Kirtland, and Kirtland is melting down. And he says, I have a promise of life for 5 years from God, and then my time's up. So I got to get my work done, right? So he runs out of Kirtland almost that day, or very soon after, goes to Missouri, and you know how things go from bad to worse there, right? And a year later, he's finally out of jail. First order of business is to get the people settled somewhere safe and then build a house of God. And if you watch him for those last 5 years, he is a man on a mission. And he seems to be the only one who gets it, right? I need a temple, I need apostles, or somebody I can give the keys of the priesthood to. I got to get the temple ordinances in them, the keys on them. I've got to have a whole bunch of sisters who have these ordinances and can officiate in them. And it seems like that just everything hedges his way in those last 5 years. That's how it seemed to him. And so you find him saying frustrated things, like getting anything into the heads of this generation is like splitting hemlock knots with a corn dodger for a wedge and a pumpkin for a beetle. Right? A pancake for my wedge and a pumpkin for my hammer, and I'm trying to cut down a hardwood tree or split right through a knot. That's a metaphor from a frontier woodcutting Joseph Smith. And he said even the saints are slow to understand. He was really frustrated, and it was hard for him. And then I won't go into all the details, but it's a great story. It's in Saints, told that way if you're interested in the story. Just, if you like a story where your protagonist keeps getting harder and harder obstacles piled on his shoulders until the stakes are enormously high and the bad guys have closed in and the dark night of the soul is there and he wonders how in the world this is ever going to work out, and then God gives him the key to everything, and then it all resolves in the end, but only after a false defeat where the hero is killed before you think he's ready to go. Then I have a book for you, Saints. It's a great story. And in the end, I'll give away the ending, they kill him, but not before he endows 9 of the 12 apostles and commissions them with all the stuff he knows, and those are the exact same 9 who end up in these valleys building temples, endowing and sealing more saints. All right, I think I've overstayed my welcome. There's 2 other parts of the book. I hope they're good. I hope you enjoy them. I hope it's worth the price and any trouble you put into it. I am grateful for your time and attention. Hope you have a great night.